behind water and tea, beer is the most consumed beverage in the world. Well, what is beer? I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure you've probably tasted of it. But what really is it? What are the components that make up beer? How is beer made? What are the different styles of beer? It's one of the things we're going to look at today. Beer's been a part of all civilizations. They have found beer recipes etched on stone tablets dating back to 3500 BC. There's an ancient hymn to a goddess of beer that is actually, when you sing the song, it's a recipe. So the recipe can be passed on from generations to generations. In 3000 BC, tribes took recipes and moved west toward Europe. And there they divided up into different countries, and they developed their own style of beers, which still exists today. Beer came to North America mainly through explorers and settlers. Through the Industrial Revolution, large factories making beer, generally in the northern part of the United States, grew up. In 1920, though, we had what's called Prohibition. Prohibition abolished the production and the consumption of beer in the United States. It just about wiped out beer production in the U.S., except for very few large corporations. But an interesting piece of legislation came in 1978. Then President Jimmy Carter passed a bill that said that home brewing in the United States would be illegal for the very first time. These home brewers began to make their beers at home, and then they started their own companies. These small breweries are what we call today craft breweries. And they began to grow, and more of them began to come about. And today we find over 2,000 breweries in the United States alone. Beer is essentially a few ingredients through an ancient process resulting in a wide variety or styles of beer. Back in 1516, the Germans passed a law called the Beer Purity Law. This law designated that only 3 products can be in beer: water, malted barley, and hops. Noticeably absent is yeast, because yeast had not been discovered yet in the 1500s. Yeast wasn't discovered until the 1800s by Louis Pasteur. So these 3 ingredients are what they called made up beer. This purity law is still in effect today, and is considered the oldest commerce law around. So the first ingredient is water. We're all familiar with water. You've traveled the country, traveled to different parts of the world, and notice how water tastes different. Some regions were more suited to making beer and different beer styles. Over in Dublin, Ireland, their water is very hard and very suitable for making stouts, which they're very famous for. In a city called Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, their water was very soft, very suitable for making pale lagers, which they're very popular for as well. In England, their water has a little bit of gypsum in it, and they realized that it's very suitable for making what's called pale ales. Here in the United States, Colorado, they like to brag about their Rocky Mountain spring water and how good it is. And there's a lot of breweries in the state of Colorado making some excellent beer. So water is the main component of beer. The next ingredient was hops. Here's some hops right here. Hops are basically a flower. They're a vining flower that grows. When you add hops to beer, they add flavor to the beer, but it's mainly in the form of bitterness. Bitterness is measured in what is called IBUs, which stands for International Bitterness Units. So the more IBUs you have in beer, the hoppier the beer is. One of the things they inadvertently discovered about hops is that hops are a natural preservative. So they were able to put hops in beers, and it enables them to preserve the beer so they can store it or ship it great distances. The next ingredient is malted barley, which I have here. Malted barley. Barley is very similar to, it's a grain, very similar to like wheat. It grows on stalks. If you take this barley and when you soak it in water, it begins to sprout or germinate. If you may remember back in elementary school, you took a lima bean and put it in a cup, a styrofoam cup, and watched the lima bean grow and sprout and turn into a plant. A very similar process to what's going on here. They take this barley, get it wet, and once it starts to sprout, they dry it out and they put it in an oven and they roast it. Sometimes they roast it very lightly, sometimes they roast it darkly. That depending on how much they roast it, is going to have a direct effect on whether the beer is a light beer or a dark beer. Malt is the main component of the flavor of beer. There's many varieties of malts. The final ingredient is yeast. Yeast is a microorganism. It's in the air all around us. It also adds to the flavor of beer. You can find it, you can't see it, and that's why they didn't know that it existed, but it is there. You can also purchase it. You're familiar with the uses of yeast as far as making bread, and you can add yeast, and it reacts with grape juice from grapes to make wine. Same process is used here making beer. Any other ingredients that you add besides the water, the hops, and the malted barley are called adjuncts. And a lot of those things are added to beer as well. You can use a variety of grains. You can use wheat, you can use rye, oatmeal, even rice. Some other things that you can add to beer are fruits, spices. Some beers have milk, even chocolate. So there's a lot of things that you can add to beer to add to them. Well, how is beer made? Well, the process of making beer is called brewing. And if you take the malted barley, the malts, you grind them up, and you take the hops, and you add them into boiling water and allow them to steep, as you would tea, for a period of time, an hour or several hours, you're going to come up with this starchy liquid. You drain all the grains off, and you're left with this liquid which has all the starches from the grains and from the hops. This hot liquid is then cooled. As we know, heat kills bacteria or microorganisms, and so we allowed it to cool, and then we add the yeast. Yeast love sugar. They love to eat sugar. And as you're probably familiar with from nutrition education or classes that you have, that when you eat, it doesn't really matter whether you eat a bag of potato chips or you eat a candy bar, your body takes those carbs or sugars and converts them into energy or else stores them as fat. Well, the same thing is going on with the yeast. They're in this starchy liquid which converts to sugars, and they just love to eat that. But this is where the magic occurs. Yeast do two amazing things. When yeast eat the starches, they pee alcohol and they poop carbon dioxide. Fantastic, right? So yeast, and that process is called fermentation. Fermentation, when the yeast eat the starches. And so through this process of fermentation, we have the yeast add the alcohol to the beer and some of the bubbles. From there, it is packaged and shipped to consumers. So what are the different styles of beer? What makes one beer style different from the other? Well, we've talked about there's different types of roasting, light roasting or dark roasting of the malts. There's also a variety of different hops. There's also a variety of different yeasts. And these different components can make up different styles. But basically, beer is divided up into two categories. One of them is ales. The other is lagers. Ales are top fermented. That is, you take the wort, which is the water that's left over, the starchy water is called wort, W-O-R-T. And when you put the yeast in there, they float on top. Top fermented. These are done generally at room temperatures between 60 and 75 degrees. Ales tend to be very rich, very full flavored. They can be cloudy or they can be clear. Some typical styles of ales are pale ale, red ale, brown ale, stouts, and wheat beers. The other category is lagers. Lagers are different than ales in that when you add the yeast goes to the bottom, and they're called bottom ferment from the bottom. They are fermented at cool temperatures, generally between 45 and 54 degrees. The word lager actually means to store. When they originally were making lagers, they would make them in the winter when it was cool, like in their cellars. And they would make this beer and allow it to ferment for not just a few weeks, but for several months. And so they would have beer during the hot periods of the summer coming up. Lager styles are pale lagers, bocks, Marstons, pilsners, and Viennas, as an example. The pale lager is the most popular beer in the world. You're probably familiar with the pale lager because that's what's made by Budweiser, which includes Bud Light and all that stuff, Miller Lite, Coors, and those kind of beers like that. The largest consumed style of beer in the world. So, what we've looked at today is we've studied that there are many different styles of beers. We've looked at the process of beer through fermentation with the yeast eating the sugars in the wort, produce the alcohol and the carbon dioxide in the beer. We've also looked at the main ingredients in beer, which is water, malted barley, hops, and yeast. Perhaps you've only tasted the pale lagers, the factory beers, the ones you can find readily in grocery stores. Maybe that's your extent of the beer that you've consumed. I would challenge you today that there are many other lagers out there, as well as a whole category of ales that are out there to be enjoyed. So today, I hope you would take the knowledge that you've learned today to explore the world of beers and all the variety that's out there. Cheers.